afternoon, everyone. Hello, it's very nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for coming to our GDI seminar. Gijs and I are delighted to be here and delighted to have you all in the audience. My name is Dr. Nicola. I'm a lecturer here in the Global Development Institute. I'm also Director of Social Responsibility for the School of Environment, Education and Development. And if I needed another job title, in the last year I've also become co-founder and chief steward of a new social enterprise called One World Together that is trying to tackle some of the issues we're going to talk to you about today. Power inequalities in the system that mean aid development is centered in the north and these organizations in the global south very disempowered in their ability to kind of respond to their communities and to kind of have stronger, more sustainable development that is rooted in communities. Gijs, let me pass over to you to introduce yourself.
I am very happy to be here. I'm Gijs from Selm and I am an alumni. I've done my master's here in international development, and since then I've moved over, first working more on this project and eventually started a PhD at LSE in the Department of International Development, also looking at localization, these debates, but specifically in the humanitarian sector and focus on complex humanities.
Great, and you can see from the logos on the screen that this is not a project that is just Gijs and myself. It's been this incredible collaborative project that we've been working on for the last 2 years with colleagues in the Netherlands, in Ghana and in Uganda. I'm going to introduce them all individually in a minute, but it's really important to know that this is a collaboration that we hope reaches into the future. Hello, very welcome. And we call ourselves the academics researching power imbalances, so it's not so much of a mouthful with all of the names as we go. So let's get started.
I want to kind of RP with CC.
Yeah.
No, it hasn't catched on that. So there's been a lot of debate about power dynamics, really speaking on allied terms, globalization, looking at development, decolonization, scholarship, power, and a lot of actions that are happening across PTOs and the world of people about, but there hasn't really been a review of all these actions and initiatives taking start, seeing are these actions enough and what's really the nature of these actions. So that's what we set out to do, and we looked at specifically how do NGOs understand these debates, and from that understanding, what's their perspective, what needs to change, and then lastly really looking at the initiatives that are taken, what how these initiatives look like and what do they really address. And last week this with
oh no, it's on here, isn't it? Sorry.
An amazing team of researchers from the Netherlands, Uganda, Ghana, and the UK, Harvard University, and the logos that we have here. Specifically, I guess that the team in Ghana and Uganda really did a massive amount of work also doing the case studies. You will also talk about a bit later in this day. But before we dive into the research, we also want to situate our research in longer debates. This is not something that popped out of nowhere. It's to be situate longer debates, humanitarian sector and development sector. And I quickly want to go into the humanitarian sector before Nicola will go into the development sector. And I want to do that by using some work of Mark Duffield, because NGOs in the humanitarian sector have been in a constant state of crisis about their position within the humanitarian system and in humanitarian responses. Mark Duffield can describe this as the politicization of aid and the crisis of dissent. The politicization of aid refers to that NGOs are increasingly seen as being an extension of Western power, complicit in the political agenda of governments, and also we look at the military, see this very much in the Iraq war, but also NGOs were used the internet just saying forcing this flyer for the intervention or the intervention, and especially after the 9/11, when a lot of non-state actors were also designated as terrorist organizations, were often the facto authorities over areas where and lots of populations living, people living that were in need of military assistance, with way more difficult to reach these people, often switching to the certain NGOs had to switch to notable remote management, where they themselves, Northern NGOs, were outside of the zone of conflict, subcontracted local NGOs that were then implementing their projects, but also really take on the risk of operating these areas. Then the crisis of consent really refers also to more the culture and the emotional distancing of northern NGOs and southern NGOs, where northern NGOs often operate in big bunkers, with SUVs, often not within the crisis, where it became increasingly difficult to relate with the population that they are assisting. This eventually results in, for instance, one NGO saying that their local partner was that they were quite frustrated that their local partner was being so emotional and took it so personal that the funding that they required eventually turned into low. But that local NGO was operating from Aleppo in Syria, or at that moment bombs were dropping. They were trying to assist their local community, and so they yes, it is vice versa. So there's also this distancing emotion. And this leads to all sorts of problems, such as accountability being, upwards rather to donors rather than to local populations, and often to an uncoordinated response where access is individually negotiated. And the humanitarian system has not been unresponsive. There have been many reform efforts that have been going on often as a response to the crisis. They don't have to have outcomes. As you can see here, many of certain crises they happened in the humanitarian response was not adequate according to reviews, and then a reform effort was launched. And especially in 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit presented a certain shift, not a critical juncture, but a shift in the debate towards an open discussion of power. The World Humanitarian Summit was preceded by 2 years on consultations with NGOs all around the world, global and national actors, especially at the moment do not really have a voice in these big national debates. And they said we need to think about power dynamics, and we really need to switch focus on the role of national, local actors, European actors in these responses. And that summit culminated into the Grand Bargain. The Grand Bargain is the agreement where big multilateral donors, international donors and big NGOs have committed themselves to transfer at least 25% of their funding directly to national local NGOs, humanitarian actors. And since then, localization, that's the framing that was used to the World Humanitarian Summit and Grand Bargain, has been the top humanitarian reform agenda. That's now stage the truth.
Great. I think it's probably worth preceding this slide with this kind of idea that although there are a handful of people, a lot of people that recognize humanitarianism and development not as two separate things, but as one thing that happens along a spectrum, and that we need to kind of look at both angles. Research as well as practice has taken quite a siloed approach to that. And you have in front of you someone that focuses on humanitarianism, someone that focuses on development. But interestingly, when it comes to this discussion around kind of shifting power and how to do that effectively, it becomes really clear that you can't have such a siloed approach. It's all very interconnected, entwined, and it's the bigger system that is kind of creating the same barriers to change, whether we're looking in the humanitarian sector or in the development sector. So you'll see, Gijs has just introduced 2016's Grand Bargain as a real kind of tipping point for localization, where big world powers all agreed to sign up to a commitment to localizing development. And that certainly marked the start of the stale push towards change in the development sector, but it has been a bit slow in response. But on the left, you'll see that there has been a much longer history of very rich, very deep critique of development NGOs and the role that they play in development. So it really grapples with the question, can NGOs be a genuine development alternative in a context in which they have largely become intermediaries between donors and local organizations and kind of been infused with the same philosophies of managerialism that doesn't enable power to be shifted to local organizations. So the role of NGO development you can trace right back in the academic literature to the late 80s, but at this point the NGO sector wasn't what it was today. It was a much smaller, more localized kind of sector. It was a very minor player in the kind of bigger picture of development cooperation. And their drawback was saying that NGOs have this potential to be a genuine development alternative for a number of reasons, but centrally because of their grassroots orientation. Unlike the state and the markets, they are rooted within their communities, they are accountable to those communities, and that enables them to pursue a different path to local development. The literature, so you see at this point money coming into NGOs, NGOs becoming a much bigger, more powerful sector, more NGOs, bigger NGOs, more professionalized NGOs coming in. And that led academics to very quickly start questioning whether or not they were able to hold on to that grassroots orientation. You can see from kind of the references I've picked, Manchester has quite a long history of research in this area. Going back to David Hume's earlier work, we've got Sam up the back, who did some great work with Diana and Tony Bebbington, and then I continued that work with David Hume more relatively recently, although that's a decade nearly, quite terrifying. And the same patterns, the same arguments are emerging. So we revisit these same theoretical challenges to development NGOs as an alternative, and we see that it just isn't possible within the bigger system. More recently, the literature has taken a very strong decolonial lens, so recognizing that it's not just a challenge because of an unequal aid chain, those inequalities are deeply rooted in colonial power. That the whole principles that underpin the system are dominated by northern kind of philosophies, ideologies, norms and practices, and that is what's so ultimately very hard to change. We are seeing massive change in the sector. I think Gijs illustrated that really well in the humanitarian sector, and in development. Among development NGOs, it's probably the number one conversation that is happening behind tables, among individual organisations and as collectives. You see social labs that are popping up to ask, what can we do better? How can we really challenge these inequalities? How can we really lead to locally led development? This was started quite interestingly as a movement by Southern NGOs. It started as a demand from Southern NGOs that Northern NGOs need to do better. We should be in control, we should be able to get more access to resources, we should be able to drive the development that we want to see. So that was 2016, the Shift the Power movement emerged. It went quite quiet for a while, but it kind of came back with the resurgence in the last few years. And in December last year, there was an amazing global summit in Bogota, and there were 700 people from organizations around the world all uniting around the fact that we need to pick up this momentum. Localization is more the term associated with the humanitarian sector, but in the development sector, locally led development has become common parlance. Everyone's using it. Whether or not anyone's doing it is the question that we're going to talk about today. Another pivotal point here in the UK was 2 years ago when the UK Parliament released a really damning critique of our aid sector entitled Racism in the Aid Sector, which I think is another really important point in kind of tackling these colonial legacies head on as well. So, lots of talk in the sector. Does it lead to action? Wrong one again.
I'd also interested to mention that also such a report was also published in the Netherlands, where they also acknowledge that there are structural racist and hateful affairs.
Okay, so we're going to have a little brief methodology from you, Gijs, I think.
Yeah, so this is basically where I came into this research. I received an email from Nikki walking outside here, Miss Selm Law Students, if I could help this as research. And what we've done is basically tried to take a very wide view. We first did a set of preliminary interviews with in the north with especially RAL organizations for northern NGOs to get a broad view, okay, what is their understanding of space and what debates are going on. And we also did these interviews in Uganda and Ghana to then use these interviews to tailor a very large survey. I think we had over 40 questions, which was filled in by over 450 respondents from 55 countries. As you can see, there's red is the global north, blue is the global south, defined by an deck sequence. And in total, we did 53 interviews. Those were not only the preliminary interviews, because after the survey, adjacent to the survey, we also did in-depth case studies of promising initiatives in Uganda and in Ghana. These were implemented by the research center in Uganda and Ghana. Next to that, in the survey, we also received a lot of policy documents about initiatives that we also took a look at. And throughout our process, we were supported by 30 professionals, practitioners from also, again, all around the world, the development field, the humanitarian field, or involved, as Katie said, they also interplay. Our whole research project was supported by Bartos, the Ship Power Lab too, with also some invest thanks to them for supporting our research need, made it that physically possible. So, I think an interesting thing to mention here is the terms are used in a mix. So localization has been used, or first really referring to the humanitarian sector, and some people say it's the humanitarian sector, then we use localization as an octagon. Some people enter localization as including decolonization. Some people take a very narrow view on it. So there are lots of terms, mostly used as a mixture, sometimes used separately just to make a certain point. But even if you split this into the humanitarian sector and the element sector, we could do that with data, then you see that in total localization springs up. But for southern NGOs, local-led development still stays the main term. So, which is interesting because as a humanitarian actor, they say local-led development. This again illustrates the point of Nicola was making about that is not really a distinction to humanitarian and development. So, what have we found? Well, first of all, there were some very clear common understandings. First of all, there is a very big power imbalance, and these power imbalances are bad to a degree. So, NGOs said these power imbalances between northern and southern NGOs are adversely affecting our partnerships and our ability to provide aid, development to communities in need. But an interesting thing is that the NGOs always refer to their own partnership as performing better than other partnerships in the broader system. However, if all NGOs say that their partnership is performing better, then most organizations feel that they are funded. So that there's some interesting question around that about incentive to do more. And on the next slide, if you look at what specific element of these power imbalance is most important, there's I guess, overwhelming majority says funding is most important. I think the saying is, he who pays the piper plays the tune. It's definitely that funding and resources that open up time to think about before and about more strategic level about your partnership often comes from having the financial resources. It was a big agreement among NGOs. So, lots is happening. This is rather about the initiatives. We group them into different categories, ranging from funding a language to funding, lost to decision making. And we split up in decision making again into internal decision making within organizations, decision making about implementation in the programming, and in policy, which more refers to law on the strategic level. about should we do, for instance, say, programs like on education or on sanitary price or something. Yeah. So with all this happening, it's also important to ask who is actually initiating this. And it's very clear that Northern NGOs, they also recognize that they are taking the lead in the discussions about it, and also coming up with the approaches with the projects. So one of the Northern NGOs also mentioned, are we not politicizing the decolonization debate? Should locally led development and localization also itself, should that also be locally led? There's a big question here if we are not doing all these reform projects in the same power imbalance that we trying to address enterprise. And that's just something to keep in the back of your mind when we move on to more to-depth injections.
Great, thank you, Gijs. So I think that slide there in particular is our first sense of unease at the fact that we have a process that we conceptualize as bringing power to the global south actually being led by the global north. And there's this immediate mismatch between what we know needs to happen and how we're doing it. And this sense of unease only deepens when we begin to look more deeply between those 5 headline categories at what kinds of actions are actually taking place to remedy those issues. And I think here in red is one of our kind of core findings from the whole project. Across the categories of action that emerge, it's really clear that the actions that are being taken are very tentative. I think a lot of people studying development will know about this ladder of participation and the idea that we can talk about participatory projects, but most of the time we're kind of tinkering on the bottom rungs of the ladder where people are consulted, but not really genuinely participating, shaping, let alone crafting and leading these programs. And that's very similar to what we see here when it comes to bringing in locally led development. The actions that are being taken are kind of the first steps on a ladder to reducing the power imbalances in the sector. This is really clear if we look at kind of 2 of the core areas in terms of tackling power imbalances, policy and programming. I thought I'd switch these around to do programming first. So let's do policy first, which is really at the top of what's going on, is how can we reshape that institutional framework in which partnerships themselves operate. There's 2 key points here that I want to point out that is highlighting how limited Southern involvement is in shaping and reshaping policies in terms of locally led development. The first at the top is that for Southern NGOs, they report predominantly that the activities they're participating in are simply conversations, not even actions. So it's starting off a process that might lead to concrete actions, but at the moment for them, the experience is predominantly around conversations. For Northern NGOs, it's also clear that we look here, partners are consulted in policy making, that it's that first step of that ladder. It's consultation, it's not kind of equal decision making or kind of moving towards equal decision making power or revisions of policy. And this little graph that comes in the slide afterwards, before we go back to programming, really illustrates that clearly. So this is, I think, the stats from Northern NGOs that were kind of taking action in policy areas. Most of them were consulting their partners. Only 15% were feeling like they equally included their partners, and then only 4% of those actions were Southern partners actually in the lead. There is a little bit of more positive story when it comes to the area of programming. And so there is a clear shift that you can see towards more equal decision making over how programs are designed and implemented. That is clear with your kind of bottom line where you've got 45% of Northern NGOs that say they're bringing in their Southern partners into these kind of critical decision making areas. I think across all of these figures there's more Northern NGOs reporting these actions than there are Southern NGOs kind of feeling like they're part of these, but it's still important. And also visible here is a favourable shift in accountability requirements. So the third one down, where partners are also getting some say in how monitoring and evaluation, how reporting lines work. And that's really important because in this managerial system, accountability is a massive burden on local organisations, and it makes a lot of time and resources reporting upwards rather than maintaining those grassroots orientation that's so important. But above all, we can say that partner-led programming, similar to policy, is much less reported, and power is still held mostly in the north. So what we see then is that whilst SNGOs, Southern NGOs are becoming more powerful in the area of programming, their ability to influence the overall framework through policy remains limited. And this begins to kind of build this picture that really questions whether or not a shift towards deeper systemic change is likely. And then we move on to funding, I think. So in funding, I don't know if we remember back to that first slide where we broke down the categories of action. And there was a lot of kind of action around this critical question of funding. And both Northern and Southern NGOs reported that it was funding that underpinned all of the inequalities that they experienced. So that seems like a really good indicator. It's the core kind of problem, lots of activities are taking place. But if we look at the types of activities that are taking place, we again see a bit of a misalignment, because the under-rooted problem is that power, both in terms of resources and decision-making power, is held in the north. But when we look at the action, what is happening is not a redistribution of that power. It is about, okay, well, to get locally led development, you have to build capacity for local fundraising at the local level. So it's not about the resources up here, it's about creating new resources at the bottom, which will give organisations more autonomy over how it's spent, because they're no longer so dependent on donor funds, on the income that they bring in. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So if you look at the demands of the shift in power movement, one of its central kind of focuses is on community philanthropy. It's about the fact that for kind of a genuine grassroots oriented process of development, organisations should be drawing on local fundraising. But in terms of addressing this fundamental question of unequal power underpinned by unequal resource allocation, what's happening is not addressing that question at all. So efforts to tackle power inequalities are still taking place within a system that is holding on to that power. It's holding on to those resources, it's holding on to decision-making power, and where it is looking at locally led development, it's saying, this is a different question entirely. We're going to give you the support you need to do your own fundraising in your own countries. If you look at the top at the progress towards more equal partner budget distribution, that's not very high at all. Participatory grant making is where you start having more say on how grants are spent. Again, not too high. Access to kind of more or improved forms of funding, so moving towards core funding, moving away from the restrictions that are placed on NGOs. The activities there are not particularly pronounced. So, we can see a lot of tensions between what localization is and calls for, and locally led development is and calls for. And this comes out really clearly in priorities. So alongside asking organizations what they were doing, they said, what are the most important things that we need to work on? And there was a massive misalignment between answers from the northern and southern organizations. So largely speaking, maybe not in northern NGOs' own words, but it looks like northern NGOs want to stay in the comfort zone. They want to look at individual changes within their partners and narratives. So at the bottom, their priority, with 35%, is around decolonizing partnerships and narratives. It's not about tackling the bigger picture of systemic change. And this comes out later on when NGOs say, actually, we can't do anything. The power is outside our hands because our hands are tied by the bigger aid system. It's really clear from Southern NGO responses that they want a much more drastic and political change. So they want greater autonomy in decision-making, in strategy, and in programs. And it's in these areas where we've seen the most tentative progress when it comes to redistributing power. So Southern NGOs are clearly asking for systemic change. They want better access to funding and information that isn't intermediated through their partners in the global north. But if Northern NGOs themselves are the ones leading the agenda, is it likely that they're going to be leading that charge? So, a general summary of this kind of section on what is being done to tackle power imbalances. There is a lot of unease here, not a particularly rosy picture. The findings suggest that what is taking place is being led by Northern NGOs. There are steps being taken to tackle power imbalances, but more fundamental and redistributive transformations in policies, funding and governance are not really, or at least not strongly visible. And these raise really uncomfortable questions. Whose agenda are we promoting when we talk about what localization is and should be, and the same for locally led development? And are the current actions being taken deep enough to address the real structural power imbalances that dominate the aid system?
So then we have to ask ourselves, what is holding us back? It's clear that from NGOs that we're not moving fast. The wire not moving fast, and that's really holding us back. It's flicked. It is again a lack of funding and time to really think about those issues. Spend time on talking about issues on a strategic level rather than on implemented projects. Here we go from project to project, and especially on interviews with Southern NGOs, it was sometimes this sense of we're just trying to survive as an organization. We do not have time to talk, or facilities to talk about these things. Next to that, there's also not a full agreement that is all very necessary. There are different degrees to which you can redistribute power, and there's also lots of NGOs, especially Northern NGOs, a unease about redistributing more power to Southern NGOs because they're afraid they do not have the capacity. And what capacity do they then not have? Is the capacity to propose upwards to donors. Definitely, if you look at discussion about capacity building, those are the issues that talk. Not necessarily talking, for instance, in the humanitarian sector, about at local NGOs, but have way more access to communities also.
We wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the case studies and their role in the research, and it was we really wanted to kind of deep dive into these headline findings to learn a bit more, because obviously behind every finding that aggregates, there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot more detail, and there's people, and there's organizations, and all of the kind of complexity that comes with that. So our teams in Ghana and Uganda did some really in-depth case studies. First of all, they kind of mapped what was happening in their national context in this area, and then selected 2 in Ghana and 1 in Uganda case studies to dive into, which was quite challenging when it comes to kind of talking to these organizations and getting a door that opens to really kind of hold a mirror up to what's happening or not happening. And the teams kind of interviewed everyone from the INGOs that were kind of the core implementing partner internationally, the national NGOs that were their core intermediary, and then the local partners below them, to kind of find out what the experiences was at every kind of link in that aid chain. So Ghana, one of the programs, explored a Northern-led program that was building local resource mobilization capacity. That was one of the core activities that we saw that was taking place, and that's a really important one to look more deeply into. And then in Uganda, we explored a 5-year project that distributed power, particularly around promoting more equal distribution of power and resources between international, national and local NGOs. So recognizing that at the national level, local NGOs had virtually no say in what's taking place, and this program built these platforms to bring local NGOs around the decision-making table. And across all of the case studies, there were some real strengths here. There was deeper co-creation of partners when it came to priorities and project ideas. There was joint decision-making in accountability and reporting requirements, so greater flexibility in how organizations report what they're doing that is less time-consuming, that makes more sense in their local language and in their local context. There was great flexibility afforded in project planning and delivery. Anyone that is critical of the aid system and managerialism will talk about the pains of log frames and the idea that the log frame is responsible for dictating the future of development. So here there was kind of clear steps to try and work with more flexible frameworks that measure what they're doing and point them in the direction of travel. There was investment in capacity building, but importantly it was along the priorities that Southern NGOs themselves were saying they wanted support in. Of course, the idea of capacity building itself is a very kind of colonial term that suggests people lack capacity, but a different approach was clear here where they were working with Southern organisations to find out what they needed to strengthen their organisations. And then particularly in the Uganda case, the idea of building strength across consortium of local actors was really core to their success. And when you have lots of small organisations that might have less power individually, bringing them together is a really core part of the story that we'll come back to later. But Gijs, I'm going to pass over to you to talk about some of the less successful aspects of the programme.
Something that really came out in the case studies is that if you are, we used to be our in all its forms, we often talk about a horizontal aid chain from donor to intermediary, NGO, Foxtrot, to local NGOs. And what happened in some of the cases and cases that we could see that even if you take away the intermediary organizations, just in the case of Uganda, where Oxfam tried to help local NGOs to be represented in meeting directly with donors, and that was successful to a degree, as some gained contracts directly with international donors, by not making that power dynamic from proximate, or is it still then that's in power exams with the people in the middle of the south. And also there was an understanding that there is also this horizontal dynamics between the state, civil society, where the UNHCR and the office prime minister, there was a coordinating military aid in Uganda, for instance, were less willing to work together with the local NGOs, while Oxfam, as the external partner in this situation, tried to really collapse this issue. There's also an important question that popped up about was there actually between the horizontal power races and first the market conditions. We're creating new inequalities also between local organizations in the capital, for instance, and local organizations that are more in rural areas, and how these themselves interact. Power does not disappear, so it goes somewhere. There's an innovation in power dynamics you need to be very conscious into intervention. And if you look at the training, yes, there were also trained more priorities of Southern NGOs, but again, you see training in forcing mechanisms and all these managerial things that help them to then be faster to the donor. And one major thing in that, there was a big success with the consortium that was formed in Uganda, where local actors came together to engage directly with the government and with international NGOs. However, when this project finished, this Chips in the Power project finished, the funding to that network also dissolved, and quickly that network dissolved. So we also have to think about, again, if you go all the way back to who's initiating this, and if we're doing this in project-based reform efforts, then it's not sustainable. Then, I guess, last is that the support that was given was also not in the form of a fund. So again, as soon as the project shifted of priorities of the international to where local, their model shifted, also the Southern NGOs were often back where they started. So to summarize, there are a lot of things happening. There's an agreement that it is an important issue and needs to be changed. It's power dynamics are adversely affecting and the revision of development aid and humanitarian aid, and that there are many barriers that also have to be coupled. Is precisely we have to look beyond the partnership. You see a lot of national, northern, southern NGOs, and we have to look at the bigger system and evolve the institution, the donors, and broader regulations and change these bigger systems to really help NGOs to make their partnerships in order this work.
And we have a bit of a video to show you to illustrate some of the recommendations moving forwards around how we can reach that more systemic change.
Is one of our team members as well. With a beautiful voice, what was willing to do the voiceover.
How northern actors can shift power and resources to their southern partners is one of the biggest and most important questions dominating the aid sector. These debates are accompanied by clear and loud demands from southern NGOs. The time for more equitable systems and relationships is now. Actions are being taken in this regard, but do they really translate into transformative change? A new comprehensive academic research has explored this question. What does the data reveal? The research shows that southern and northern NGOs recognize the negative effects and frustrations associated with power imbalances in the global aid system. Both also recognize funding as the main cause of the power imbalance and the main barrier to change. However, discussions and actions taken towards tackling these power imbalances tend to be led and dominated by the North, with the vast majority of northern NGOs having initiated such discussions compared to only a minority of southern NGOs. This raises the question of whether the decolonization agenda is being colonized. Most actions being taken to shift power focus on funding or programs. However, the majority of these actions relate to promoting southern fundraising. Rarely addressed are the systemic imbalances like equal partner budget distribution or provision of core funding. Although southern NGOs are becoming more powerful at the programmatic level, they remain constrained in their ability to influence the overall framework in which these programs take place. When it comes to decision-making in policies, southern NGOs are mostly consulted rather than being equally included, let alone being in the lead. So what is holding us back from reaching deeper change? At the moment, actors perceive their efforts to shift power as being better than the norm, impacting their efforts to do more. A large group of northern actors believe that genuine change is outside their own circle of influence. The majority of southern NGOs, however, claim that the lack of progress arises from northern dominance and unwillingness to change. So what could guide the way towards systemic change? Reaching transformative change requires that 1. Northern NGOs move from leading to supporting southern NGOs in taking the driving seat. 2. All NGOs look beyond their own individual partnerships to challenge the power distribution of the broader aid system that sustains top-down decision-making, resource distribution, and agenda setting. 3. Call upon institutional donors to unite and, as core architects of the aid system, take a lead role in redesigning it. 4. Openly communicate the barriers that NGOs face while acknowledging the limited room for maneuver that occurs from donor restrictions. 5. Address the uneven allocation of financial resources and funding conditionalities that drive inequalities in the aid system. It is up to all actors in the global aid system to look beyond individual partnerships and to take responsibility for the broader system in which they operate. Want to learn more? Then take a look at this research's policy brief and the full report for more details.
Ta-da. Feels like we're quite redundant because the video
This is Counterclean.
does such a good job of
The last clean spray bottle you'll ever buy. We were tasked.
yeah, the video does such a good job of contextualizing this nearly 100-page report into something really kind of biteable and manageable and illustrative. It's fantastic. And thank you, Badru, for his brilliant voice. Oh no, it's this one. Voiceovers. So, we are reaching the end. We will not go over the recommendations because these are the ones that come out of the video that you've seen. But it's worth saying that they have been this report has been really well received by donors and NGOs. We have kind of presented it for the Dutch government and presenting it to the Portuguese Development Agency in May. All of these northern kind of umbrella organisations that kind of work with organisations around Europe are trying to build on this research to kind of take forward their strategies and direction. So people are listening. We don't know yet where it's going to go, but it makes it even more important to kind of build from this research in ways that kind of continues to shape the agenda and continues to push it away from this northern-led kind of process into one that is leading to a more reimagined and transformed and southern-centred future. If anyone's quick with getting their phones out, there is a QR code there that will take you to the report and the video. If not, it's quite easy to find it online. So I think we wanted to finish off by just talking about, okay, so we've done this big piece of research, so where do we go from here ourselves, not just for the aid chain? I've kind of taken, alongside kind of the research of the past 2 years, I've taken the rather drastic step of kind of launching with University of Manchester students, some of whom are in the room, a radical new social enterprise that kind of takes the power and control over these processes away from the donors and the international NGOs that are proving so hard to change, and putting that power and potential of transformation in the hands of us, all of us as global citizens. So we designed One World Together as this really affordable, financially sustainable and radically transparent alternative where people can sign up to become a global citizen for a very small annual membership fee and then give as little as £1 a month to us, which we pool and give every penny of that to our 4 brilliant partners who you can see at the top. Critically, we give that funding on a long-term, predictable and unrestricted basis, which is something that just does not exist in the broader aid system. And to me, it's the only bit of the equation that will truly transform the aid system, is when we get much more and better funding to local organisations. So that's really what we're trying to do. There is a University of Manchester Students' Union Society that I would really encourage you to get involved with. And we've recently sort of set up an institutional membership with the University of Manchester that enables University of Manchester students to become global citizens with no fee at all. So please join us. Come onto our community space where we link you up with our partners, and you can really learn and get involved in these discussions and debates and kind of shape a movement. If you can sign up to the Solidarity Fund, that's great. If you can't, it doesn't matter, because it's about building a movement and an appetite for change. I could talk about that for another whole hour, but we won't. Okay.
Yeah, so I am doing a PhD now. However, NC, it starts with not a master, so actually my master was working on a proposal. So my research has not felt much after this project, but I intended to look at not as again and doing case studies of specific programs and projects, but look beyond that why Southern NGOs engage with this on these discourses in the first place. What is their reason for joining this? Hoping to put their perspectives and their barriers to these more central in research. And I want to do that in northwest Syria, probably from Gaziantep, which is just across the border, where lots of local NGOs and international NGOs interact, and want to look at what is really functional, participating in this debate, but do the NGOs gain in the first place from engaging and that they fed forwards to projects. Yeah, not much more than that.
And then for RP, the very catchy acronym, for the bigger collective of our broader team, academics researching power imbalances, I think, I mean, we are so proud of this report, and it's so important that we have this knowledge base to work from. But it was also, it stops at almost the important moment, because we kind of thrown out the kind of enticing conclusions and feature recommendations about reimagining the system. But I think Northern NGOs and donors are wanting something a lot more tangible, which we can't do with this research. No research project can do everything. So it's really important to us to kind of find a way to kind of take this forward in a way that answers some of those, so what happens next, questions. For us, given this kind of misalignment between seeing all the action happening at the individual level within partnerships, but the real need for things to happen at a collective level, both within Southern organisations but also across different levels of the AHA. For us, the critical actor to kind of bring out is the role of Southern Umbrella Network organisations in this process, in playing this convening role at the national level to bring local organisations together, to build a collective voice, to kind of house this reimagining and transformation of the system. We had a really interesting conversation with Partos when we finished this report and kind of gave them the findings. And after that day I said, but we as Partos, we're looking for what we can do, and I've got this meeting with all of the other European umbrella organisations in the next month. I'll report it there, we'll have that collaboration around what we're doing. But it's really hard for us to know how to support this process. And I said, well, how many Southern umbrella organisations do you have in that room? The Northern kind of model is still, we'll come together in the North and figure out what we want to do, and then we might work out how to do it by bringing Southern organisations into the room. But it's very clear to us that we can't answer this question of what happens next until we bring the key actors that we need to the head of the table, and we know a lot more about them. So I can't think of any research projects that are looking at the role of kind of network organisations, despite everyone knowing that they have a really prominent and powerful role in our own sectors in the global north. So we've got Volunteer, we've got Partos, and every European country has a really major network organisation that kind of supports the sector as a whole. So yes, we are looking for funding for that at the moment, which is hard for similar reasons to this, in terms of kind of finding funds and resources that allow you to study these things with a large international team, when a lot of Northern funding proposals only allow you to keep, they like to capture a certain amount in the UK and you're only allowed to send certain amounts overseas. So it's very hard, we've worked out, when you have 2 European countries and 2 international partners, to find a place where we can get some funding that really makes us, enables us to work. And we managed this one purely by everyone doing it on their own time, rather than applying for a big fund for us. So yes, that's us. We hope you've enjoyed the seminar. Thank you very much. We'd be delighted to